Hello, Uju Asika. I am so delighted to have you on the Therapy Works podcast. I feel like I know you because I've read your wonderful books and we've had what feels like important conversations virtually. But this is a different kind of conversation here on the podcast. And for those that don't know you, you're a writer, a blogger, and a creative consultant. You're well known for writing two big books, Raising Boys Who Do Better and Bringing Up Race, How to Raise a Kind Child in a Prejudiced World. And then a children's book, which is called
A World for Me and You, where everyone is welcome.
Yes. So it's the same theme of diversity in that we need diversity like we do in our microbiome. We need it in our lives.
Yeah.
We need all identities, colours, races, and that they're enriching. And we flourish when we allow them. That's the message I got from that book. So hello.
Hello, thank you for having me. Yeah, it's great to talk with you again.
And so the question I always ask every guest is what is a particular challenge you are facing or have faced?
A particular challenge, well, on a superficial level, I will talk about the tech challenges. We were chatting just before the show, and I was saying I don't know if it's Mercury retrograde or something along those lines. But yes, so it's been one of those weeks where I'm just trying to lean into my most patient self. Yeah, and on a sort of bigger, more, I guess, existential level, I think the challenges of parenting when the world feels like it's on fire. So, how to maintain my composure, my optimism, and keep the kids on a sort of an even path as opposed to getting sucked into all the whirlpools on social media and mainstream media. Actually, I find there's a lot of toxicity and negativity. So it's just trying to stem that and stop it from entering, trying to filter it from our daily lives. And then I've had many, many different challenges. Obviously, I'm an adult orphan. Yeah, so next week, I believe, will be my the ninth anniversary of my mum passing away. And this year is the 20th anniversary of my dad passing away. So yeah, that's
Gosh.
been a tricky one to kind of navigate.
Yeah. So, I mean, in some ways, where I go being a therapist is you as a mother are very influenced by you as a child and how
Mm,
you were mothered and your experience as a child and how that is shaping you now. And so I imagine there were challenges that you experienced as a child that are informing your challenges and how you want to protect and keep your children feeling safe and that they're living in a safe world when it is also a very frightening, threatening world.
Definitely one of the challenges I've written about in bringing up race was obviously arriving in the UK as a young girl. So I came when I was 7 and then went to boarding school, an all white school, and experiencing, yeah, a real sense of otherness and I guess displacement, but also direct and indirect racism as a child, and just grappling with that, and that being something that just became like I talk about, for instance, the first time someone called me the N word, I guess I was around 7 or 8. That was,
Awful.
yeah, that was another child. And it's one of the things that I write about and I speak about because obviously this was a white boy who had learned this word and had learned that it had some kind of power and had decided to use it against me. And I think about what were his influences and who did he grow up
Who
to be?
gave him that word? Yeah.
Exactly. What has he learned over the years? Does he have children now? Has he taught them differently? So these were some of the things that informed why I wrote Bringing Up Race. Is really a lot of this stuff does, like you said, it starts in childhood, and how do we create those spaces where children can feel like we're safe, we belong, and yeah, I'm just as as relevant and welcome as everybody else. So yeah, I think that was one of the definitely a huge impact on my life was experiencing that when I was so young.
Kind of looking at your face and hearing you say that, it feels like from innocence up to the age of 7 to when you came to the UK and being kind of in some way exiled into a boarding school where you didn't know how it worked and you were black and the majority were white, and also you didn't have a language to bridge that or to make sense of that. It almost feels like it was this kind of scar that will always be in you, and the influence of that, I'm making this up so put me straight, has kind of informed so much of your life now. It's like I don't know, is there a conscious or an unconscious part that is always influenced by that shock of the N word, of feeling so different, feeling othered, that you're always bridging or allowing yourself to recognize that you belong and you're welcome, but there's that 7-year-old little girl in you who's still hurt?
Yeah, I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head. And on one level, there is always that little girl in me who feels the sense of pain, the sense of, I think there's a real shame that you feel. Someone asked me if I spoke about it with my parents when I was young, and
Yeah.
of course I didn't. I never brought it up. I would just write letters home and talk about positive things or strange things that I was discovering, like the food, which I found really quite
And the
difficult.
weather.
Yeah, difficult to handle. Yeah, but
Yeah.
aside from I wouldn't talk about that, like for instance, that specific incident. And I was fortunate. I mean, I had my older siblings were they're older than me, but they were at the school, so I wasn't completely isolated. But I think there was about 4 Black people in the entire school. So yeah, it was different, but it's a weird one because on some levels it becomes your strength as well. And
Yeah.
I talk about that sense of the outsider perspective and feeling othered, I guess. I think it helps you with empathy, and it also helps
Mm.
me with storytelling because I'm always able to see things from multiple perspectives to feel like I'm there but I'm not there. I'm inside but I'm always an outsider on some level.
That sounds so creative in the sense of like your inside 7-year-old self, but also you've developed a voice and a way of storytelling that gives you different perspectives so that in some ways that allows you to support the 7-year-old. And also like a mission that you don't want anyone to feel like that. I mean, in particular, your 2 sons, but also any other young child from any background.
Absolutely. That's it. Like no child should feel like they don't belong or that they are powerless. And also, no child should feel like they can use somebody's difference against them, which is,
As a weapon.
yeah, as a weapon. And that's kind of one of the central messages. The subtitle of Bringing Up Race is How to Raise a Kind Child in a Prejudiced World. When I was first pitching the book, I first pitched it as How to Raise a Happy Child. And then I thought, actually, no, I want to move beyond the idea of just a happy child. I want a kind child because I want that sense of intentionality and ownership, raising kids who are conscious of the impact that they can have and how your happiness is actually tied to other people's happiness. So it's not just about it's not just about you, and that's where the kindness comes in. Kindness is contagious. That's a line in my picture.
Yes,
It is
it
contagious,
is.
and that's kind of why I had that as the subtitle of the book.
I love kindness being contagious. I remember when I was about 10, I was given a little gold smiley. Do you remember those smileys with just little spots for
Mm.
eyes? And for my birthday, and I'd say in my head over and over, and it isn't exactly the same, but it just brought it back to me. Smile a while, and while you smile, another smile, and soon there's miles and miles of smiles. And I think there was a kind of desperation in the 10-year-old me that kind of was smiling through things that I really wasn't smiling about. But
Mm,
in connection to you and kindness, it was like what you didn't receive was kindness.
mm,
And what you needed was kindness and empathy. And so, in some ways, you're turning the table on what injured you most and kind of saying, no, this is how I want to live my life. I want how my sons live their lives. But I also imagine the antecedents of kindness and humor, because you have a lot of humor in your books, which is a kind of kindness, isn't it? I mean, of course, humor can be vicious, but in your book, it isn't. It has a real warmth and a kind of connectivity. I imagine the seeds of kindness came from your parents, although they were the generation that didn't talk about race in the same way as you are. And maybe talk a bit about that.
yeah, 100%. My parents were both extremely kind individuals. And it's interesting because growing up, I was very much a daddy's girl. I was very close to my dad, and my dad was kind of very soft natured, very strong willed, but soft natured, similar to me, or I'd say.
Yeah,
and
right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And my mum was much more in the house. She was much more stern. She was much more sort of
Strict.
disciplinarian. Yeah, she was strict. She
Bad
was
cop, good cop.
exactly bad cop, good cop. And we had a much trickier relationship with my mum. I would say my sister and I. My brother was the oldest, and he was,
The
mama's
golden
boy.
child.
Mother's boy. Then my sister and I had the challenges. So there was a little bit of tension growing up. But in terms of just her nature, outrageously generous. Just the both of them, they were collectors of, well, of things, but also of people. We always
Oh,
had, and
lovely.
they were like the heads of the household for both. We had very large families, and everyone would congregate at our house. And I had very much an open door kind of experience growing up with all of our family members and cousins. And to this day, I mean, it's partly a cultural thing, but to this day, there's people who call my mum who are not even remotely related to her. Some of them are like
Isn't that
almost her
wonderful?
age, but they will still call her mum because of the kind of relationship. And the way she fostered relationships with people was really something incredibly special that I would love to emulate. I think it's just you can't really, you can try and emulate it, but I think it just comes from within. That's just how she was. And same with my dad, just extremely generous and caring individuals. So the last chapter of the book, I had kind of almost partly dedicated to them with the expression, be cool, be kind, be you, because
Yeah.
I think that really captures both my parents.
And it sounds like you were brought up with the idea of it takes a village, that in some ways that you had a village that you were raised up in, and that's a culturally based, but also from their hearts, that they were
Mm.
generous and wanted lots of people in your lives and lots of people to love you and lots of people for you to love. And yet your mum was the stern mum to you at home. And I'm wondering, was that an influence of racism, that she was trying to shape you to kind of be good enough in a racist world so that you didn't suffer? It's like, was it internalized fear in a way?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was thinking about it the other day because I mean, both my parents met overseas. They were students in America, and that's how they met. So I was thinking about my mum's journey from going from Nigeria to, again, similar to us, but she was an adult going overseas and being kind of a foreigner and displaced. And my mum had very quite sort of strict rules about things. So when we were growing up, she would be like, oh, this is how you do this, and this is how you do that. And I was thinking about it, like, obviously, a lot of this was westernized and Western ideals and Western values. And I was thinking about how maybe that did come from that sense of feeling othered and trying so
Fit
desperately
in.
to fit in and then passing that on to us. Yeah, so it's interesting that you talk about it. I wasn't thinking about it specifically with racism, but I guess racism is a part of that because it's the othering, isn't it? And it's the that feeling like if you don't if you don't toe the line on some levels, then you'll definitely be ostracized. But if you can assimilate to a greater degree, then hopefully wouldn't stand out. And yeah, it's interesting.
I can see you kind of processing as you're talking. It's like trying to make sense of it for yourself. And I imagine there's a version of that that you do for your boys that maybe you're not even aware of. Your boys are virtually young men, aren't they?
They are. So my eldest, he just turned 18.
Wow. He's
Yes.
legally an adult, but
Yeah.
probably
As he
really
tells
still a
me every
child.
day. He tells me often. I'm an adult. And it's very funny. It's an interesting looking at your child. And he is an adult and he towers over me as he loves to tower over me.
So
But
sweet.
I just see the baby in him still. So I guess I'll always see that.
And your other child's 16 then?
He just turned 15. Yeah.
15.
Mm.
I mean, that's an interesting process, isn't it? Parenting adult children. I mean, I don't think an 18-year-old is an adult. They may legally be an adult, but
Mm.
I think young, there's a whole developmental phase up to about 25 or even 28 until you're fully an adult. But the difficulty psychologically is like he keeps reminding you because he wants you to like step back, like mum, stop.
Yeah.
And you were saying, I still see him as a little boy. And he's saying, no, I'm not a little boy. And so that, and I imagine that's a bit like your parents with you. I don't, how old were you when your dad died, by the way? And was he Nigerian as well? Were they both
Yes,
Nigerian?
both my parents are Nigerian. So my dad died when I was 30, and he died after, so he had had a series of strokes. So he had his first stroke, which was a very sort of catastrophic stroke. And when I was 20,
Gosh,
so yeah, so I was like second year, just about to enter the third year at school, at university, when he had that stroke. And yeah, it was awful. He nearly died. He was in intensive care for weeks and then in hospital for months. And when he came out, fortunately, he was mentally sort of okay. I mean, mentally okay, emotionally ravaged, but still himself, but definitely like a diminished version of himself
yeah,
emotionally to a lot of extent. And then also he was, because he was in a wheelchair then, because he was paralyzed on the left side. So that was difficult. And yeah, at the time, my sister and I mean, we were living out, but we then moved back home to help. And so my brother was in Nigeria and we were with, my dad was here. So we all sort of moved back home to be with my parents and help look after him. And then he had a second more severe stroke 5 years later. And with
gosh,
that one, he was not able to, I mean, we weren't able to look after him. So then he wound up in a nursing home for about a year. Actually, no, about almost a year and a half. Then my mother was able to move him back to Nigeria, where he was in hospital for a bit. And then when he came out, he was actually a little bit more improved than he had been when he was in England. And I think there was something about being home,
home,
yeah, being home and
safe.
and safe, and that helped him. So even though then he didn't really have his language, but he had a little bit of it. And then yeah, and then the final stroke was when I was 30, and that was the one that
Gosh,
took him. Yeah,
but that's 10 years of really enormous loss and distress. I mean, obviously for your father, but enormously for your whole family, for your mum caring for
yeah,
him. And you at 20, I guess it was your first real experience of something terrible happening out of the blue.
yeah.
And so it's like you're thinking of your son in 2 years' time if that happened to their dad.
Yeah, I can't imagine it. I can't imagine it. I think of, I mean, I guess then I was 20, and back then you kind of think your parents are sort of old. And obviously there's a thing with this generation where, I mean, I'm 50 now, and I don't know like whether my kids think of me as old in that sense, but my mother was just 55 when my dad had his stroke. So thinking back, I'm like, my goodness, I kind of just thought, oh, they're old and they're having this tough time, but actually they weren't old at all. My dad was 58. So yeah. So it's really difficult to think about, and no, I can't imagine. My sister was saying it to me because during the pandemic, my niece was staying with
Mm,
us, and she was 20, and my sister just said, "My goodness, do you realize that she is the same age that you were when that happened?" And it was bizarre to look back and think how young we were, and yeah, it's difficult. And my brother would have been 26, and he was then in Nigeria, and he was sort of having to look after everything in Nigeria and be the so-called
the father or
man of the father figure, man of the house thing. So yeah, it was tough, but it really brought us together as well as a family. I think a
brought
lot
you
of that,
closer.
yeah, definitely a lot of that kind of tension that we'd had, especially teenage years and stuff with my mum. All of that just kind of melted away because I guess this was more important just to be there for
Much
each
more
other.
important. How do you think that has shaped you though? Because that this terrible thing happening out of the blue, and then it was progressive. Like it didn't stop really until he died, and it was like a part of him died every time, but
Yeah,
like there was less of him. And witnessing that when he'd been like you were daddy's girl, and he adored you, and he was your strong dad, I guess, and then suddenly he's so diminished and so physically kind of irreversibly changed.
yeah, yeah. um, yeah, it was really tough. It's still tough,
I
looking
can
back on
see the
it.
sadness in you.
Yeah, I had some counseling a few years back, mainly for sort of anxiety, and I just wanted to get a grip on it. So I just had a few weeks of counseling, and it's interesting when you go because I went in thinking, oh, she's going to help me with anxiety, and we wound up talking a lot about my dad, and I think it was that sense of losing him in stages that I'm not sure I've really still come to terms with. It was, yeah, it's,
So painful.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was difficult. Um,
And it is
and
difficult. I mean, what I'm aware of is the sadness that you feel now. And I imagine there's kind of two voices in you. One is that you want to kind of put that down because I'm not your therapist as such, and you're wanting to kind of be the self that I always see, which is cheerful and articulate and so on it. And there's a part of me that wants to connect to the 20-year-old you and the 25-year-old you and the 30-year-old who, in some ways, I think it's a lifelong process, processing these really significant losses. And in some ways, there's no sense that can be made of them, is there? That a young man, a middle aged man, would have these catastrophic strokes. And I guess that fear, the anxiety. I mean, if I was your therapist, I would definitely link to your underlying anxiety, if that's what you had or have, to that, because it's like there's something bad can happen round the corner that happened to you. You can't
yeah,
not know that it can happen again.
yeah, I think that's exactly it. It's so, yeah, it feels like obviously when it happened, it was out of the blue because a stroke is like that. It's just a shock.
It's like a
And
car crash, isn't it? It's just
yeah, exactly. That's it. It was like we had a car crashing into our family
yeah.
life. And then kind of grappling with it sort of over the years and finding, like I said, the joy and the love and the connection that we felt as a family. And then when my dad died,
Yeah.
when my dad died, my mother's grief was a lot.
Yeah.
She'd been holding so much in, and I guess we didn't. We were still children. And like you said, when you're 20, 25, even at 30, I was still kind of just coming into adulthood in a sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was a lot to process my mother's grief at that time when my dad died. I still remember just, yeah, yeah. But
It's a lot. I mean, what I was thinking, having had a mum who's so kind of like both incredibly generous and loving, but also quite fierce, so powerful.
yeah,
That role, I guess, was reversed. Like you kids, I'm sure, were mothering her,
yeah,
and that's such a shock when she is devastated because she imagine she'd held it in for the 10 years because she was his principal carer and
she was
had to
as well.
keep had to
Yeah.
keep on it, but then grieved 10 years worth of him really. How was your relationship with her over the 10 years that she lived after he died?
It was good. We were close. I mean, it was close, but at the same time distant just from, she was in Nigeria.
Nigeria.
And so I was here. So there was a period when I was in Nigeria, then I moved back here. That was the year after my dad had died. We moved back here and I was pregnant. And so then I had my babies really without her. I would take
Oh,
them home to Nigeria to see her, but the experience of having them was without her. When I was pregnant with Ezra, she was really trying to come over, and there was a whole thing with her passport, and sometimes they just make it quite challenging. So she wasn't able to be here. And
oh,
yeah, that was difficult. And I think one of the things that I struggle with is that sense of mothering without a mother, because had both the babies without her, and then yeah, and then she passed 9 years ago. So now I'm just continuing, kind of fumbling my way along as we keep writing all these books and try and figure something. Yeah,
did she die suddenly?
she died suddenly, and she had always said that that's how she would go. She used to say,
So she was
uh,
68. She was young. Six.
no, she was then, she died in 9 years ago, so she was 74, I think, when she died. She actually passed away.
If you're
And she,
64 like me, that feels quite young, but I don't think it is in real terms.
yeah, yeah, I think but she used to say that she would never, she didn't want us to go through what we went through with my dad. So she used to say to us, when I die, I'm just going to go like that. And, and then she did. And it was really,
Wow.
yeah, I
She
was
made it
really,
happen.
yeah, she died in her sleep
Oh,
and
wow.
um,
At peace.
at peace, with a smile on her face,
Oh, wow.
which, yeah, I guess you can't ask for a better way to go for her. For
No.
us, it was, yeah, devastating. Like, I was saying to
Devastating.
someone the other day, I'm still not over the shock. Like, I still can't, especially because I was here and she was in Nigeria. And then my brother called me and it's like, this has happened. Just felt impossible. And she felt like one of those people who would live forever. She had
Yeah.
my grandfather, so my great grandfather, her grandfather had lived until we're not even sure how old he was because he didn't really have records, but he was in his like 100 and possibly
Wow.
180, something like that. And he was
Oh,
very,
my
very
God.
old. And so we always and I used to say to her, when she would say, I'm just going to drop dead, I'd be like, no, you won't. You're going to live till you're like 120. Um, that didn't quite work out. But yeah.
And it's such a contradiction, isn't it? On the one hand, she had what I would think of as the death I would choose, like it's a good death, dying
Mhm.
peacefully with a smile on your face, in your home, in your bed. But the shock of it is ricocheting through your body because it also keys into the shock of your dad, right? So
Yeah.
there's both of them so sudden. And the shock of it and you sort of facing that challenge of raising your children without either of your parents as an orphan, as you said at the beginning of the podcast. And there are many people who don't call themselves orphans when they're adult without their parents. It's such an interesting perception. It feels like there's a child in you that feels orphaned.
Yeah.
And you, I mean, you're incredibly clever and articulate, but it does feel like that your writing has been for the child in you, like the blogger Babes About Town, and then Raising Boys Who Do Better and Bringing Up Race is the kind of looking for the mother in you to be able to enable you to be the mother that you want to be, because you didn't have a present mother
Yeah.
to call on or to fall back on. Is that too simplistic?
No, I think that's spot on. I think that's exactly it. And it's something I've thought about writing about as well, that sort of sense of trying to mother yourself. How do you do it? And I mean, when I wrote my picture book, I think the night before it was published, I wrote a blog post, and it was really like one of those, like a letter to my younger self. And I wrote to my 5-year-old self just to say,
Oh,
we've got this picture book and it's coming out, and I've written it for kids, and I've written it for you, really, because you never had those types of books. When you're growing up, like a book that in my picture book I wrote about, like jollof rice, and it's like full of different people and languages and just things that I wouldn't have had. I was reading, I don't know, Rupert Rupert the Bear
yeah,
and Enid Blyton and all that stuff. So I think that's really interesting. I haven't thought about the fact that everything is kind of to my inner child. I haven't thought about it that explicitly, but yeah, it's really. I think you're right.
and if your 5-year-old was speaking back to you, what she'd say?
Yeah, I think she would be just so excited and giggly. I was very
Yeah,
giggly,
yeah,
giggly child. Yeah, so she would be excited, amused, and a little bit, I guess, shy. But yeah, very uh, pleased to see herself, I guess, on some level centered in all of
yeah,
this work.
yeah. It's like sort of chuffed, like she's moved. It feels to me, and seeing your face as you're speaking, is like you've managed to take her internally, probably without consciously knowing it, from a place of danger where she was othered and not safe and didn't have language, didn't see herself represented in books or TV or anything, built a bridge and lifted her into your own village where there are kind voices and multiple voices and richness and color, and she belongs. Like she's the center of her world where she can be carefree and skip and giggle and be shy, and that's a freedom that she didn't have.
Mm,
I saw her before as like caged in some way where she shriveled, and now that she's in open spaces. It's what I picture when I see your face smiling at me.
that's so lovely. I love how you've put that. I'm really glad that we've captured this so that I can write it down somewhere. Yeah, I love it. I love that image. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I'm so much more. I think this isn't necessarily useful for you, but I'm just what's popping into my head, so I'm going with it. Is a lot of people are quite dismissive of the child in us in therapy, like giving the child a voice or kind of picturing the child, and that it's sort of woo woo. And I really, the more I do this, and I've done it like 34 years, the more I see that the child, and in a way, you're a demonstration of this, is like shaping everything. And that we need to kind of have a conversation with the child within us so we know how she's doing, and that we can haul her out of dangerous places and put her in safe places with her kind of people who love her around her so that she feels safe, or he, or they,
Very
or
true.
whoever.
True. I remember. I don't remember when I first started hearing like the talk of the inner child sort of slipping into mainstream conversation. I mean, it's been quite a few years now. And then, of course, when it first came out, it was like revelation, and people were like quite excited about it. And now, like you said, people seem a bit. It's just like something that's easy to
Dismissive.
make fun of. And
Yeah.
is that not interesting? Because so much of culture is quite a bullying culture. And I think that
Oh,
that element of the bully, when you think about the bully, it's a hurt
yeah.
child. And
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that so much of the bullying culture would pick on something like an inner child because probably it connects in a way that's really quite painful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Uju, you have just sorted something out for me. That is so good. That's so clarifying for me. I'd never thought about it like that.
I just thought about that now. It's just, yeah, just when
Yeah.
you're talking about it, I'm like, it's true. Because when you think about children and there's normally an instinctive feeling of protection, but then, yeah, I guess through so much of society, children aren't protected. They're just so vulnerable. And yeah, it's up to us. I mean, anybody who, and I don't think it's just parents, anybody who cares about like life or society or the planet, or you have to start caring a bit more about children and what they're seeing and how we're responding to them and treating them. So I mean that's why like I follow a few sort of conscious parenting or intentional parenting writers or blogs, influencers. And sometimes for me, it's like trying to find that balance between what are my personal values as a parent and then what am I actually still actively learning from the intentional parenting movement, because yeah, obviously you can go to different extremes as well when you're trying to find that way forward. But I think just that effort is what matters, isn't it?
The effort and the intention and I think the
Yeah.
persistence.
Mm.
So can I kind of now like link that to this amazing work that you've done about race and identity and boys in particular? Interestingly, I interviewed Caitlin Moran a few weeks ago, and her book about boys and men, having been a very kind of strong feminist and thinking it's not her business. So when you're talking about children and that whatever our role is that we need to kind of be tender and listening to children and supporting children of all hues and genders. But I think what you're also saying is there are some who have more vulnerabilities than others right now. And actually, girls are suffering terrible mental illness. So, but to put that aside, maybe it's not less or more, but the areas you're interested in is boys and race.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me with the boys, it's obviously I'm a mother of boys and I've got my sons, I've got a stepson. I think about my nephews, like
Your
I've
brother,
got one active nephew and then my little younger cousins and nephew. But I just look at them and I mean, there have been books written about boys more in recent years, but I feel like there's still just not that much of a coordinated conversation about what it means to be a boy in today's world. How do they come to grips with all of society's expectations
and
around
changes.
masculinity, how it's changing, how it's being kind of pushed and pulled in different directions,
And
you know,
hijacked on the right by Kate
hijacked
or
completely,
Ua. Mm.
and especially with social media. And obviously, we know about all of that man named Andrew, as I call him now. It's a bit
Yeah,
like he's like Lord Voldemort. You shall not be named. I'm
yeah.
tired of talking
No,
about him.
no.
That's why it's like
Yeah, yeah.
named Andrew.
Don't give him the
Um,
attention he's longing for.
exactly, exactly. So it's like, how do we support boys through that? Because I feel like on many levels, they're not that supported. There's a lot of, even though we still live in a very unequal society when it comes to not just race, but gender inequality, and girls are still, there's
Behind.
all of the UN statistics will tell you that we've got a long way to go before
Way to
we've
go.
cracked this
Mm.
sexism thing. But for boys, when it comes to boys, they don't have that much. You don't look at books that say, how to empowering boys, or when they're little, it's like boy power, or boy power sounds a bit wild, but actually they also need positive and affirming
Agency. Yeah.
messages,
Yeah.
and just a more expansive, for me, I think it's really about a more expansive idea of what it means to be a boy. Can I be, my son's a very, I was showing, I sent my, so I speak to my son in especially my eldest, in memes. We think as part of my love language with him is just like sending him or spamming him with memes. Like sometimes I'm like, have you seen this? He's like, I haven't been on Instagram today, Mom, leave me alone. But like I sent him this video, and it was like one of these influencers, a video of, she said, boy mums and what we experience. So one of the things was basically this boy like punching his mum, play punching, but just like standing punching his mum. I was like, oh my goodness, this is my life. But obviously, I mean, what's helpful is seeing things like that, which show you that, yes, this is also
There's,
normal. That's part of the normality and the normal
yeah,
range of masculinity, but it's also okay for the boys who like want to wear a dress or
cuddle up.
up, and they can exist within the same boy, and that's all great and it's all good. And yeah, so that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is just how do we raise boys who feel better and do better, and how do we do better for the boys who are growing into the men we want to see, the kind of men we want to see in
Our
society.
sons to have friends with, my grandchildren to be with, to
Yeah,
future bosses, future
future
friends,
partners. Yeah,
future partners. We're coming to the end, really, and the image I'm left with is that in some ways, through the door that you were thrown into of racial abuse and discrimination and the confusion and injury that left in you, and then the kind of devastation at that door of your dad, his strokes and his multiple strokes, and then your mum dying, is that you were born in this environment, that you had your natural gifts and who you were and how they parented you, and the kind of Nigerian culture of connection and creativity. But what it feels like the experiences have done is put you to another door where you're wanting to highlight how we can live without prejudice towards men or women or racialized discrimination, that you're using your injury to want to build a kinder world.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess so. I don't, I haven't like obviously articulated it for myself exactly like that, but I think that that's true. I was reading something about empathy, and it was talking about how so many people who are more empathetic are also deeply wounded, which
Yeah.
is a sad thing on one level, but also a positive thing because so many of us are deeply wounded. And if we can channel that into something that allows us to see other people more clearly and make more space for other people to be fully themselves, that can only be a good thing, I guess.
And try and influence them to go in that direction rather than become the bullies.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And we need that influence, especially in times like these. I don't know. I always say these are wild times and they feel increasingly, yeah, just intense.
Frightening.
But I guess, yeah, frightening, unsettling, disturbing, disillusioning, disempowering. Sometimes you feel like, is my voice, does it mean anything? Does it count? Sometimes you just
Can it
think, is anyone,
land?
yeah, are the people who have the power to change things, are they listening? Do they care? But I guess it's just, yeah, leaning into the feeling of there are other people out there who do care, and yeah, just having community is the way forward.
I think having community, and also you have a voice now, and there's the idea that I've always had is that you change one life, you change the world. I mean, it's a Jewish sentiment. And it feels like you can feel so powerless when the world is on fire, like you said at the beginning. But actually, if you're nurturing your own garden and your own village and your community, and you're influencing one person who will read raising boys who do better or bringing up race, and that they will do differently as a result. That's a really powerful thing. I wouldn't underestimate it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's something that I know, and yeah, I will forget. I forget that I've
Yeah,
written these books that might influence people. So, yeah, thank you.
yeah,
Thank you for the reminder. It is helpful, and it is, I guess, what drives me is that sense of if it's just one person you can reach who might see things in a different way or try to engage with people in a be anti-racist as opposed to just like sit on the fence somewhere. Yeah, I think
they're
that
actively anti-racist.
actively
Yeah,
anti-racist, yeah, actively, and especially in this age of anti-woke. I was having this whole conversation with my sister and the whole like anti-woke thing, and yeah, it's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's how you take a word and you twist it and then you use it and you weaponize it.
yeah,
You're essentially saying you're anti consciousness, you're anti empathy, you're anti kindness, you're anti justice. That's essentially what you're saying, but you think you're clever by saying you're anti work.
and funny, and you think it's
Yeah,
funny. You kind of make something serious funny, and then you can say whatever you like, and it's so
yeah,
not fucking funny.
it's just not. It's just ridiculous.
So to end, for people listening, do you have a final message that if they took one thing from you, you'd want them to know?
I think what we've been talking about just now is that you do have a voice and your voice matters.
Yeah,
Something that I say to people of all ages. You can be a small child, you can be an elderly, you can be from whatever background, but your voice really does have power, and it has the power to change the narrative, which is really what a lot of my writing is about, is like how do we shift these narratives that have had a hold on us for so long and tell better better stories, better, more inclusive stories. So yeah, your voice is powerful, use it.
yes. And you can remind yourself of that too. Thank you, Uju. That feels such a beautiful and tender conversation and such an honest conversation. I really appreciate you for being so open. And I guess neither of us knew where we were going to go,
I know I
but
would
it
have brought
feels
my
like a
tissues if I'd been prepared. it's, it's all good. Yeah, thank you so much for, I mean, these conversations that you have really are so powerful, and the way you hold the space that you give for people and you hold people in that space is really, yeah, special. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That really means a lot to me. Thank you, Uju. So, Sophie and Emily, our mother-daughter segment about my conversation with Uju. I'd love to know your first thoughts.
I mean, it was such a wonderful conversation to listen to.
And felt like therapy a bit, didn't it, after the beginning?
Yes, like that she sort of had moments of connecting things. But also what really sort of struck me was her experience of racism and the scar of that, and her wanting others to have a different experience, while obviously being shaped by her own really difficult, appalling experience. And I just felt like that was such a sort of generous approach to life. Like I've experienced these injustices and attacks my whole life, which I think could have and wouldn't have been wrong to have sort of polarized her in a different direction. But instead, her approach was to sort of have this really generous thought around how do we make the world different? Like the world has not been inclusive of me, but Uju herself is including everybody in the conversation. And it just really struck me the sort of generosity of that, and it made me kind of curious about how she had the capacity to be so generous in her framing.
Yeah, she is such a generous, and she's so lovely to listen to. She really takes you with her, or I felt very taken with her. I also related to, I could also hear that when you are trying to do something like that, it's so big, and she talked at one point about feeling like, does it make any difference? Sometimes she doubts whether it makes any difference, and when you see other things in the world, that you can get kind of like quite hopeless about, is anything really changing? And I've thought about that quite often. You never really know the role you play in life. Even working with clients, sometimes you work with someone and you don't really know, did I help? Was this, or the next part of the story, right? Of the moments of contact or change, the person who reads her books. You don't really know what journey you might have sent them on. And I really remember it when I worked in prisons. My boss, Alice, used to say, it could be the loosening of the jam jar. You just never know, because obviously lots of the men we worked with would go back to prison, because that was the nature of the systems we were in. But when you get someone gives you a jam jar to try and open it, and like you can't open it, and then you pass it to the next person, and it just goes like pop, and you never quite know if you were like the precursor to the like loosening it, so that the next, and it's hard to know in time where what you're offering is. You can only offer what you have to give, which it feels like she does so deeply.
Yes. And I think about this, and this is a slight tangent from Uju, but I think about what you were saying, Sophie, in terms of, in some ways being a therapist is quite an egotistical job. Like, I think we like to think that we can make a difference. And of course, that's our intention. And hopefully sometimes we do. But there's also so much that we're powerless over. And I think so often with therapy, it can be the time that somebody is ready to hear something or explore something, or the systems around them have shifted or something, and the bits fall into place, and that's things connect, and that's where real change happens. But all the sort of heavy labor where it feels like nothing is happening at all, and you really question yourself, and all of those things sometimes go into then creating that moment that can happen, or those moments that can happen. And I imagine that sort of similarly to Uju, that somebody reading her book, it might be the moment that all those sort of things fall into place and kind of things make sense. It was such a incredibly useful book. I have a son, and I think it's an incredibly helpful book to think about. I'm talking about the one about boys. I know she's
bringing up boys,
about bringing up boys, exactly, and making a difference in that way. I also just thought, I hope men are reading this book. I hope it's not just women. Like, because me and my husband, I think we have different ideas about what it is to raise boys, and that's not a bad thing. And my husband is really, really progressive, but he grew up in the South in America, in quite a sort of conservative area. And there are some things that he sort of knows that he doesn't want to be uncomfortable with, but he just kind of is uncomfortable. Like, the discomfort is there. Like, if he sees my son wearing nail varnish, and he has like a reaction to it, he can't help, and he's got another part of his brain saying, "Oh, it's fine. You can wear nail varnish, it's fine."
Because we can't help our first reaction.
You can't undo your own cultural,
training,
societal, internalized reaction. And so I think it's a very good book in terms of sort of thinking about a dialogue about what it means to be a boy and raise a boy.
Yes, and it's a really challenging moment, isn't it, politically, around this stuff, because there's been this big wave of the hashtag Me Too movement, and a sort of certain kind of confrontation with masculinity that has been quite polarizing as well as really positive. And I think one of the things I really enjoyed about when she was talking, it was sort of this amount of love and affirmation and kind of tenderness that boys need in their identities, such that we can be sort of responsible for how we behave, right? There's such a kind of quite sort of persecutory narrative around men at the moment, not boys, but around men, and not without triggers, like domestic violence is dramatically increasing, rather depressingly, in the UK. But the sort of question is good to ask is that she's asking us, like, well, how are we raising boys to turn into such men?
I mean, that's sort of in the introduction to her book. If you read it, which I'd really recommend, she talks about the Sarah Everard murder and how she saw this graffiti where someone had written, like, "Protect our girls" or something, and someone had sprayed over that. They'd like crossed it out and written "Educate our boys."
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
Really powerful.
To move it sideways and to kind of pull out, not Uju specifically, but in a broader sense, my area, I guess, more my area about grief, how to mother when you don't have a mother, and how to kind of get access to your internal mother and not sort of I think the way she accessed her internal mother was actually to write the books, because I think her parents were very generative and very generous. And I was thinking for other people how there are many ways of accessing and connecting to a mother or a father that's died.
Sounds like you have specific things in mind that you do with clients. I wonder if that's helpful to offer. If you're something that people bring to you often, how do you?
I mean, the specific things is that the continuing bonds, the continuing relationship. So the task is to face the reality of the loss and allow yourself to recognize it. And in her case, her dad had died, but also to find ways of connecting, that the love for them never dies, and that you can ask your internal relationship with your mum, or use touchstones, whether it's her ring or a photograph or writing a letter to mum, what shall I do? Shall I send my son to this school, or shall I do this, or how shall I, he's done something wrong, what am I going to do? And actually you can use your internal mother in the same way as you have a kind of internal child. And I think really believing and trusting in that can support you to feel confident enough to parent, because otherwise I think you can get in quite a heightened state because you feel like such a child, because being a parent brings out the child in you, obviously. And then often in grief, people turn against themselves and attack themselves, which is an incredibly cruel but very common version of grief. And then they become exactly the person they don't want to be.
So excruciating.
Yes,
I mean, I have a few thoughts, but one of them is a sort of something I have done. Obviously, I haven't lost either parent.
Hello.
But we had, but we had a very, very lovely nanny who was a big part of our lives, who died a few years ago, and she was a sort of very much a maternal figure in our lives. And one thing I notice is her voice in my head when I am parenting. So there's like certain phrases that I will say and I'll be like, oh, like where did that come from? Like when I wipe my children's bottoms, she always used to say, bend over to Dover. And I find myself saying those things, and it's like a connection.
I thought I'd said that, by the way. I'm still
okay. Well, maybe
with
you have.
after
Maybe
she
you
died.
did. Or just yes. I mean,
but it is Eileen. She has phrases.
She had phrases and sort of
go man go. That's what I always say.
The ways she'd sort of prepare us. I mean, the details are obviously sort of in my mind.
And material.
I think it's just sort of noticing that she's kind of there with me. And then actually one of my friends who had a sort of similar figure in her life does this really lovely thing where they used to go over there for tea, and they used to get a sort of her children used to get a special biscuit when they went to see this person. And now she's sort of instituted that. On Fridays, they have like Nana tea, where they have like a cup of tea the way that Nana would make the cup of tea, and then they have a Nana chocky, because Nana would always give them a chocky. And so there's something about
rituals,
the rituals and the sort of continuation of the love that is then being remembered by your children, who maybe wouldn't be old enough to remember the person themselves. And I suppose these are all really lovely things that I think you are able to do when you've had a mother who is a good enough mother. I think what's much more challenging is that when you have a mother who's maybe still alive or maybe has died, but who maybe didn't give you the kind of parenting that you needed for whatever reason, not about blaming or shaming. And then you are sort of trying to give your children something different, but you've got this quite blank template of how to do that. And I think that could be really challenging.
I just wanted to add about transgenerational is that we often talk about transgenerational trauma, but of course you have transgenerational love, and that the good things.
The angels in the nursery, Mum.
The angels in the nursery, but I think we often focus on what are they? The devils in the nursery.
Ghosts.
The ghosts.
Ghosts.
The ghosts from the nursery, and we don't emphasize enough the angels in the nursery because it's sort of negative bias. So I think it's those the rituals that you were talking about with Eileen or with whoever it is has been in your past. I think are very powerful, and we need to affirm them and validate them.
And I think I've talked before, there's a very lovely paper called The Angels in the Nursery by Alicia Lieberman that I'd really recommend.
It's also a reminder, isn't it, is that if you are in that situation for whatever reason, that your parents were not people that you can draw on for the kind of parenting you want to do, it doesn't have to have been your parents that you can draw on, but they're figures in your life outside of that who, although they weren't your parents, you got something from. And what was it about those experiences that had meaning and that gave you feelings of love and support? That's teachers, that's grandparents, that's godparents, that's cousins, aunties, uncles, friends of your parents. I think a lot of people draw on sometimes their friends' parents when they used to spend a lot of time at their friends' houses and experience something really different to maybe they experienced at home. And to give yourself permission to channel all sorts of people in your parenting.
Role models.
Sort of role models. It made me think, actually, I was going to ask about you, Mum, because I would say you're a person who've really tried to parent differently to the way that you were parented, rather than, I don't think you were channeling the GMA a lot, as much as we love her.
As much as
Loved her. How did you manage this dilemma?
Am
I putting you too much on the spot?
No, I think. Well, I just don't want to be too mean to my mum now that she's died, but I would think what she did and think, what was the reverse?
And you had Nanny.
I had Miss Lance, but she was very old-fashioned.
Yeah.
I read a lot, and I made lots of mistakes. I did lots of things that my mum did without even knowing that I was doing them. I think I was really parented by you telling me what you wanted and what you didn't, and me trying to listen to you rather than me knowing, to be honest.
No, I don't buy that.
What do you mean?
Well, I think like maybe as adult children, like it's much more of a dialogue, isn't it?
Not yes, but as young children, no, I didn't expect you to know
children.
as young.
No.
As little children, no. I
But
think
therapy,
I got a lot
right?
from Eileen. I had a lot of therapy, and I think I've always known how to love. I think that was just in me, and I mean that sounds a bit arrogant, but I think I do.
Yeah, no, that's not arrogant. Yeah. And probably you must have felt loved at some point by somebody.
Yeah. Can we move now?
Sorry, Mum.
I mean, I'm moving, but I'm not moving very far. But I'm moving away from you. Just because I think we've been talking about parenting, but I think another thing that came up was thinking about childhood and thinking about your childhood in therapy and thinking about your inner child, and it's such a sort of cliche, isn't it? Like, go to therapy and talk about your parents and talk about your childhood, and it is a cliche, but it's also sort of one of those things that's a cliche for a reason. I mean, I think like there's this sort of your earliest experiences do help make sense of where you are now. I mean, I think we know more and more and more that even like your in utero experiences have like a physiological impact on the wiring of your brain. So it really makes sense to go back all the way back to even when like your mother was pregnant with you, or to sort of help make sense. And it's just like a piece in the jigsaw puzzle. It's not the defined. Yeah, it is. Of course, it's also not a predictor, right? Like you can have a very difficult, stressful pregnancy, and then other things happen, and your genetic makeup that mean you can still turn into like a really resilient, healthy, happy person. But I think it is always helpful to go back at some point and think. And then the other part, which is sort of separate, is thinking about your own inner child, which is different to your childhood experiences, and that we all do have that sort of little person inside of ourselves that it's most of us, I think, ignore a lot of the time, but that I think because, like Uju was saying, that it feels like a vulnerable part, or a part that you sort of maybe don't want to connect with. But I think the more that you can sort of take care of the little person inside of yourself, the more self-compassion you have. And I think I've spoken about this before, but my supervisor gave me this really lovely idea, which I use because even children have inner children, which is like a Russian doll. Yeah, like you have like, you're sort of 10, but you don't want to get bigger. Some 10-year-olds
Yeah.
don't want to get bigger. Some
Yeah.
10-year-olds want to get smaller
Yes.
or stay the same. Lots of young, like even children that we as like grown-ups think of as young, but they feel scared of growing up or feel scared of change, but they can't avoid it. They are going to get older. And so like I have these Russian dolls. That's my supervisor's idea, credit to her, that to sort of think about there's all these different parts of you and how do you take care of all the different parts, because you actually also need the big part too.
That's so lovely.
Yeah, I think, often that little person has something very important, but sometimes very inconvenient to say. So we don't like to tune in because it's inconvenient or difficult or troublesome in some way to let ourselves know about ourselves, that we feel we shouldn't feel, or it's disruptive, or other people won't like us feeling it.
And maybe right at the beginning it was also impossible, like we couldn't, because we were just trying to survive, and so we worked all these like adaptations or defenses in order to sort of survive, and whatever that means. But now you're sort of maybe at a place where you are safer, you can go back.
Yeah, and
I don't think you can change so much in the middle of the crisis.
No,
I think in some ways, often you do the best therapy when the crisis is past, and then you have enough internal safety to begin to focus.
I was only going to say one last thing, which was that to sort of hold a little bit lightly, maybe sometime, the fact that how you feel now about yourself or your inner child is not the end of the story. That I think sometimes, particularly if we've had very traumatic childhoods, we can have a story in our head that we're broken, sort of fundamentally we've been broken or damaged in some way that is irreparable. And not to undermine that feeling, because that is something that people can often feel, but to also let ourselves know that our brains are plastic, that the possibilities of who we can become and grow are still present. And that although it's helpful, really helpful to go back and make sense, that's not the same as then needing to define us in the present, that's all we're then we're never going to be able to go beyond what's happened to us. And so sort of letting ourselves know what's happened, and also letting ourselves know simultaneously that this is a snapshot in time of how we feel about ourselves. It's not the end of the story. Does that make sense?
It makes wonderful sense. It's a wonderful place to stop. Thank you both very much, and particular thanks to Uju for the books that she's written and for her sort of honesty and openness in the conversation with me, and all that she's doing this really important work. And thank all of you listeners. And as I always say, do please share this if you think it's helpful for someone. Do rate and subscribe so that we can be found. And thank you for listening.